Missing one? Any extras? Extras? Okay. Okay, so before we get into like the little like me blabbing part of the day, I just want to say a little bit about lab in general. So comparative vertebrate anatomy is overwhelmingly full of crazy, cool, interesting stuff. There's way too much for us to like do. And so I'm going to share it with you guys a little more fully later, but I just want to give you some insight into the things I want you to get out of this lab. So we are going to have a lot of specimen-based work. Like today, there's all these skeletons. So there's going to be specimens from like biology collections. I'm going to bring specimens up from the museum. When we're dealing with specimens, I want you guys to please be as considerate and careful as you can be. Sometimes they're in cases. Sometimes it's okay to take them out. Sometimes it's not. I'll try to be clear about that. But please try not to break anything. If you do break something, let me know. Don't be like, whoop, and like hide it. Because these are specimens, especially like this gator. This is an alligator, a little baby gator, has been in biology for quite a long time. And it's great that so many students have had the chance to learn from it. So please be respectful of specimens. The other thing, of course, that we're going to have anatomical specimens. Some of those are going to be like formaldehyde or alcohol, so like brains or fishes or whatever, so you can see internal structures. Please be very careful with those. Those are very expensive. And you guys are going to be doing, in a few weeks at least, real dissections. There's a bunch of animals we have back in that room, a bunch of interesting things. Once we do the biodiversity and you guys kind of have that down, we're going to be doing dissections ourselves. So I'll get more into that later. But specimen work, dissections, working with models, all of this, the skills I really want you guys to develop in the lab part of this class are observation. So there's going to be tons of me being like, what do you notice? What do you see? Because I feel like a lot of the information content of the class like this is very easy to like kind of suck up and be like, got it. You heard me say it, or you saw a slide that said it in a bullet point. It's way better if you're sitting there looking and you can actually see the nerve go around the heart valve. And that's why, you know, this thing happens. You know, we're going to talk about all kinds of interesting things, I think, that involve like why we humans have some weird health problems, like why we get hernias or we have slip discs. There's all these things that suddenly are like very obvious why they happen. And so I can tell you about that. But when you guys are looking at specimens and understanding the anatomy yourself, making observations, I hope by doing that, you'll have like some agency. It's like, oh, wow, it's like, I can see this. Another part of that, which some people always get a little bit like about, is depiction. So art, you don't have to be a great artist, but I am absolutely going to ask you to like draw and illustrate stuff as best as you can. A lot. This class, this lab today especially, you're going to be drawing skeletons. So some of you might be like, can't wait, and you'll sketch this like unbelievable skeleton. Other people are going to be like stick figure skeleton with some details on it. That's okay, but I want you to always be kind of thinking depiction, trying to show clearly. You can show so much in a picture that you have 5 paragraphs to show a simple thing you can draw. So anyway, 2 skills are observation and depiction that today we're definitely focusing on as we're learning these basics of anatomy. So I just wanted to say that out loud as we got started, and to please be careful with specimens. So this is a wonderful bony skeleton of a cheetah. So a cheetah, like any organism, is a modern living thing, millions and millions of years of natural selection crafting that thing. There are tons of details in this cheetah skeleton that make it like any other cat, but then there's tons of very subtle specializations all over the hind limb, in this part of the spine, in the eyes, in the shoulders, that make cheetahs capable of doing these things that are totally incredible. And so the sort of sliding scale that we're going to cover in this class, from like a shark versus a cat, and then like how a cheetah is like so much an extreme kind of cat. This like sliding scale of specificity and detail, I think, is really pretty fun. And so I'll try to be really careful about which ones we zoom on and which ones we don't. And today is definitely about the big picture. You guys will be looking at completely different kinds of animals today. And so today is all about animals that have bones. So the rest of this week in lecture, well, that's not totally true. Most of the animals we're going to talk about, certainly tomorrow, are animals that do not have bones. Actual bone is a synapomorphy of a kind of vertebrate. There's a clade of vertebrates that have bone as a synapomorphy. Some of the animals we're going to talk about tomorrow do not have bone. We're going to get a lot more into what bone is as we go through lecture this week. But since this is a very skeleton-focused lab, I wanted you guys to have a little bit of detail here. So maybe because I just kind of blabbed for a second. Talk to your neighbors for like a minute. This is a picture of two kind of diagrams of bone, both like, you know, could be a femur, could be a tibia. They're totally different drawings, but they're trying to show important information. Just take an observation here, make any kind of thing you want. Talk to your neighbor about these two pictures of like a section of bone that's in a living organism.
On the picture to the left, like on the bottom of there, talk about how there's like fibers that go out in rings, and every layer of the rings, which is a lot more complicated than I thought. But it also explains why that's.
All right, can I take just anything you guys want to say? Any observations at all? I'm not looking for any one thing.
I really think it's interesting how like the blood supply through vessels.
So bone is one of the weirdest of the tissues in your body, and it is just a normal bodily tissue because people sort of think of it as like almost crystalline or mineral, and it has a mineral component that we're going to talk about, but it's absolutely a living thing. You know, I mean, just a second ago when I showed you that awful broken femur, your bone has the ability to like break and repair itself. Your bone is not just bone, it's full of blood vessels, it's full of nerves, it's full of living things. We're not going to talk about it too hard right now, but this diagram here, if you zoom in really close on all these little spidery things that are barely connecting with each other, and then there's like little pouches in between, inside each one of those is a cell called an osteocyte. It's like a living cell, like with a nucleus. It's like laying down crystalline structure and keeping in touch chemically with all the other bones. Your bones have physiology. So bone is a living tissue. If you break your bone, like I said, your bone will heal itself. It is not a piece of glass. It is the rigid structure of your body, but it is a living thing. Like I said, we're not going to take a deep dive into all these words, but I just want you to like kind of take a second to realize how absolutely wild bone is as a living thing. We're going to get into that a lot. Here are some like absolute basic starter words that we're going to start talking about. Most of you probably know these words already, and you probably already wrote them down, but just to cover bases, we're going to go through them all right now. So you can break the vertebrate skeleton. We have a person up there, but any vertebrate, you can break it down. There's the axial skeleton. So the axial skeleton is based around the midline, the center of the body. Remember, all bilaterian animals, you can cut them in half, up and down, or like this way. And so the axial skeleton runs down the middle. The axial skeleton has the skull. I bet you guys all labeled the skull. The mandible on a lot of animals, not all. Well, so like a lower jaw. The vertebrae. So if you're ever writing about vertebrae, singular, just one of them is a vertebra, no E. And if you're writing about a few of them, it's vertebrae. And then the ribs that attach to those vertebrae. And so we're going to get into all that kind of stuff. I'm just saying the words right now. So that's the axial skeleton. The other kind of skeleton that we talk about is the appendicular skeleton. So your appendixes, you can think of it as your appendages, I should say. And so those can be broken down between the top, your forelimbs, and the bottom, your hind limbs, or the back and the front, your forelimbs and your hind limbs. And this is true for almost all walking vertebrates. And so we call all of these bones up here the pectoral girdle or the shoulder girdle. And there are developmental, so if you go into like an embryo, developmental homologies between your pectoral girdle and then this one down here, which is your pelvic girdle. And then you guys probably have known this, whether or not you realized it in your life or not. All your limbs have one bone, two bones, a handful, five, you know, they stretch out. Your hands and your feet are extremely similar to one another, and so are your shins and your forearms. That's also developmental, which is also really, really cool. So the one bone at the top on the pectoral girdle is the humerus, the bottom is the femur. And then within the next part of your arm, there's two bones. The next part of your leg, there's two bones. They actually are developmentally paired. The radius in your arm and the tibia in your leg, the ulna in your arm, the fibula in your leg. We'll talk about which ones are which as we keep going. Any bone in your wrist or any bone in your ankle is called a carpal is one that's in your wrist. A tarsal is one that's in your ankle. There are different bones. You guys probably have heard a lot of different words for ankle bones. I heard people talking about talus, astragalus, calcaneum, heel. These are all revolving around the same idea. They're all tarsals down here in your ankle. And then as we get down to your hands and your feet, the bones of your hand, these ones here are the metacarpals. You have your carpals, and then past that, your metacarpals. In your foot, you have your tarsals. And then when someone gives you a foot rub or whatever, they're usually all up on your metatarsals, your actual foot bones. And then at the end of your metatarsals, the end of your metacarpals, you have your digits. And your digits, we're going to have a whole bunch of terminology for. But on both your fingers and your toes, we call these phalanges. Phalanges. Single is phalanx. You don't often use that, but like just this thing is a phalanx. These two together are phalanges. So just to get the words all straight, they're written down. Of course, these slides will be on Moodle. You guys probably had a lot of this straight already, but there it is. I want to make a really important point here, and I heard people talking about this. Humans and human medicine was its own field for a really, 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 really long time. And then biology came around in the Western world, and now we understand humans as part of the tree of life. So there are about 1 million words that are for humans only, but they're talking about things that like all mammals or all walking animals or all vertebrates have. And that's super, super funny. So you guys might hear in a human class, like when they're talking about anatomical directions, they'll say like superior and inferior, which is like, what a nightmare. You're like, this bone is inferior and this bone is superior. And what they mean is like up or down. Something I want you guys to think about, and this is like a really good comparative anatomy start to the class. We are like all the other mammals, except we went like this. So we changed our directions by like 90 degrees. So all the words we could use to talk about the dog for like front and back and top and bottom, they don't make sense on you when you're standing in a normal human-y way. So for this class, because this is comparative vertebrate anatomy and not human A&P, always imagine people like this, and it'll be so much easier for you. Imagine they're doing a bear walk or something, and then you'll get it. And the homologies, of course, are very clear when you have the human posed like everybody else. Just to put that out there. So there's that dog with the axial skeleton in one color and the appendicular skeleton in another color. Okay. Before I get into details of the different bones and the names, I want to give you guys some anatomical directions. So these are not just bone words, these are words for all of anatomy. And so you can feel free to put labels all over your dog and your fish that are on your notes. These just help us describe things to one another. This is going to be really important later when we're doing dissections. You're going to say this nerve is in this direction relative to this other thing we're maybe talking about. So we're going to do it on skeletons because skeletons are relatively easy. Right now you're looking at a dog and a fish. This fish is called a bowfin. We'll learn about them, I think, on Thursday probably. Both of these skeletons are in lateral view, which is side view, and they're in left lateral view, which means you're seeing the left side of the dog, the left side of the bowfin. So in left lateral view, some of these directions you guys are gonna be like, duh, I think I already knew that, but that's just what we're doing. The front direction towards the head, the front of all animals, we call that vertebrates, we call that anterior. Anterior is towards the front. I'm sure you guys all know what comes after anterior. Posterior is towards the back. In the up and down plane, we've got dorsal. So dorsal is the back of an animal. You guys already have talked about in class a little bit. Dorsal fins go on the back. Anybody know the flip of dorsal? Yeah, ventral. So the stomach side, the soft side usually. Dorsal ventral, and that gets compressed. When people describe things, they might say it's dorsoventrally compressed. They mean in that plane it's compressed. It's antero-posteriorly compressed. That means it's smushed front to back. So these words can easily be turned into descriptors themselves. Once we're on a certain piece of anatomy, say we're on the arm of this dog here, again, the dog's in left lateral view, we have words like proximal, which means towards the midline of the animal, towards the spine, usually in a vertebrate is what that means, proximal, and distal, which means farther away. Something that's really important for you guys is that every word we've seen so far, these are all relative terms. There's not a dorsal part of the animal. You use these words in your descriptions when you're talking. So this bone right here on this dog is the ulna. The ulna is absolutely distal to the humerus, which means it's farther out than the humerus is from the middle of the animal, but it's proximal to the metacarpals. So the ulna is both proximal and distal at the same time. These are terms we use to describe spatial relationships. Here's that same dog and then that same fish, but with a fun picture from the front. So now they're not in left lateral view, they're in anterior view. We're looking at the front of the dog, the front of the fish. All bilaterian animals, so that includes octopuses and spiders too. All bilaterian animals have a midline. So you could cut them in half like this and they would have symmetry. It gets fun in your guts, but for your skeleton, this is a pretty safe thing. And so from the midline, we can also describe things relative to one another. Medial is another relative word that means towards the middle, towards the midline of the animal, medial. And then the opposite of medial is lateral. And so that, I hope, isn't too surprising for you. It's the side, going out towards the side. We were just seeing the dog and the fish in lateral view. So mediolaterally compressed, mediolaterally expanded. These are words that people can mash together to talk about a shape, talk about a structure. All right. Another thing I want to get going today, since we're seeing so many skeletons, this is something that came up for you guys. So I gave you like some fossil early land living vertebrate on your information notes, and then I give you the same dog again and the bowfin, the fish again, because I want to talk about vertebrae. You guys, and regions of the spine, that was something that came up for people, the vertebral regions. So let's get a little clarity here. We're going to start with fishes. That fish is more indicative of the ancestral condition for all three of these animals than the other two are. And so fish vertebrae, if you're being as simple as we can, are broken up into two regions. One is caudal. So these are the vertebrae that are turned up a little bit. They're not that easy to see on this drawing, but you can just trust this little bar. Turned up at the end. These are the caudal vertebrae. Caudal vertebrae are vertebrae that are in the shape of the tail fin. Caudal means tail. So these are like the tail vertebrae, caudal vertebrae. And then in most like early fishes, anything that's in front of that until basically you get to the back of the skull, people call pre-caudal vertebrae. Sometimes they're more specific, of course, but for this class, we'll keep it simple. So does it make sense that you have your tail vertebrae, which looks pretty different, and then everything in front of that is the before tail vertebrae, the pre-caudal vertebrae. So in fishes, that's going to be, if there was an ichthyology person, they'd be mad that I'm doing this, but we're going to keep it simple, pre-caudal vertebrae. So now if we take another look at the two tetrapods, the two animals that have arms and legs, of course, the reptile has caudal vertebrae. All the vertebrae in the tail of that reptile are also called caudal vertebrae, tail vertebrae. Now, going from the back to the front, just because, all the vertebrates that walk around on land have structures the fish absolutely does not have. They have sacral vertebrae. Sacral vertebrae are the vertebrae, usually there can be just one, there can be dozens, there's a lot, it really varies. Sacral vertebrae are the vertebrae that are fused, usually, to the pelvic girdle or articulate with the pelvic girdle. A couple of vertebrae that are connected to the hips, truly with a bony connection, usually, sometimes it's cartilaginous. That's what a sacral vertebra is. Your sacrum, which is a bone you're all using right now, your sacrum is a few vertebrae all fused together, and then that fuses to your hips. Your sacrum is made of sacral vertebrae. In front of the sacral vertebrae, you have the before sacral vertebrae or the pre-sacral vertebrae. Now I drew this up here because we are going to break that up a little bit. So it's going to be a little bit messy and interesting things happen because there's a lot of diversity. But in the pre-sacral vertebrae of tetrapods, so animals with 4 legs, arms and legs, there's ways we can break this up, and most people have them broken up. There are the dorsal vertebrae. So dorsal is an anatomical direction we just learned. It's also a descriptor of certain vertebrae, dorsal vertebrae, like the name of those vertebrae. Those are the vertebrae in your backbone above your sacrum. Those are your dorsal vertebrae. And then all these animals that are walking around on land also have a neck, and those are their cervical vertebrae. So that lizardy thing has cervical, dorsal, sacral, and caudal vertebrae. And if you want, you can lump all the cervical and dorsals together and call them presacrals. That's sometimes things you might see. So that's true for a lot of, now we've talked about fishes, and actually a lot of the animals that are kind of reptile-y, amphibian-like. These are probably the words we need to describe those. You guys are mammals. You know a bunch of human words, not even just the mammal words, human words. And so, of course, the dog has sacral vertebrae, cervical vertebrae, and caudal vertebrae. You also have cervical vertebrae, sacral vertebrae, and caudal vertebrae, although all of your caudal vertebrae are fused together into that bone called the coccyx, your tailbone, that curled up inside your body, it doesn't stick out. But you do have those as caudal vertebrae. And so, of course, the dog also has, and of course, you also have what any anatomist could comfortably call dorsal vertebrae. But, and I need you to hear me when I say this, mammals and mammals only have a division in their dorsal vertebrae between thoracic and lumbar vertebrae. So thoracic vertebrae have ribs attached to them. The rib cage originates from thoracic dorsal vertebrae. Lumbar vertebrae are those ones without ribs between the sacrum and the thoracics. There's usually a lot of bendiness in the spine of your lumbar vertebrae. And so, of course, you guys know that, like, for almost all of evolutionary history, vertebrate spinal cords have been arranged like this, and humans are like this. And this is the part with very little other support. So a lot of people have slipped discs and lumbar issues because you put all your weight on top of this thing that's got sponges between it. It's very funny and very weird. Obviously, it works fine. Any questions about this? These are the slides I like to make just because then if you ever are like wondering, you can go back and be like, oh, right. Okay, sorry if it's boring. I wanted to do just a little bit of the bone walkthrough. So you guys have the note pages on this, just with some pictures. And again, these are all going to be available online. So the pectoral girdle is the place where the forelimb comes out of. And so this is the girdle that's up here. Some of the bones, there's many of them, believe it or not, and I've not shown you most. There are bones like the scapula, the coracoid. You do not have a coracoid. Lots of animals do. You don't. We've lost ours. The clavicle, that's your collarbone. So this is this lady's shoulder. Here's the big dinosaur skeleton. And I like to make these slides because I want you guys to see the homology. So this big dinosaur has a scapula, has a humerus, has a radius and an ulna, and they are homologous with yours. It also has other bones like an interclavicle. It's a plate-like bone on the middle of the body. You don't have an interclavicle. Those might come up later. All of this is to say the pectoral girdle has a bunch of actual specific bones in it. Scapula, clavicle, coracoid. The spot where your arm articulates with your pectoral girdle, there's a specific name for that socket. That's called the glenoid. The glenoid. And so the glenoid is the socket your humerus fits into. On you, it's just your scapula. On a lot of reptiles, it's the scapula and coracoid. So it's called the scapula coracoid. So the glenoid is where your arm fits into your shoulder. Here is a wonderful drawing. I'm sure you guys have seen these in high school and middle school, probably, maybe in intro bio, of course. Just showing the bones of the forelimb, but again, with a little bit of a comparative anatomy angle. So there's the arm of a really early tetrapod, an animal on land, a vertebrate on land. And then there's 4 mammals. I know you guys have seen stuff like this before, but because I'm blabbing so much, talk to your neighbors for a second. What are some things we notice about the forelimb of these different organisms?
Oh, we talked about embers. Yeah.
Yeah. So like all the carpal, like it makes that like all the and I think like right before and then
Did not agree with that for all the whales they did.
originally I would be that like have pigeon.
Oh,
Like I'm on that.
So what are some observations, questions, anything you're wondering about? Fun stuff. This is the good stuff. Obviously, we'll get into it more, but
Whales have a lot of phalanges.
whales have a lot of phalanges. Anybody know what that's called? You remember? He was in a class, or you were in a class with mine before.
No. I don't.
Hyperphalange is what that's called. Whales have, you've got 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, a lot of finger bone. Now, whales do not usually bend their fingers. Pretty rigid in a flipper. What other things?
Can a flipper bend though?
Oh, yeah.
Don't they have some?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's got a little movement to it. But there's not like
Right, it's not.
some humpback whale at the surface with 8 feet of like, that doesn't happen. But there's flappiness within it. What else though?
The phalanges in the cat, it seems in different directions.
I can't do it without having to go to the hospital, but if you, a cat is walking, there's like a phalanx, and then this one is like, I can't turn it 90 degrees like that. And then you guys know that if you have a cat and you don't have to declawed your cat, they have like a terminal claw that they can like pull back and forth. So cats are like walking on this one, and then these ones are like curled up. Very different, but they're all still the same. That's why this looks like such a little nightmare down here, these little sticks. Toe beans, people think to call them, right? Push on them and then the claw goes. Yeah. How about the bat? The bat is the one that I think is the most like us in terms of like, you know, straightforward, but then of course it's not like us. But it's still, it's crazy to me that it's still inside that bat wing. It's all the same. Bones. Bye. It's awesome. So the mammal skeleton in particular, we say is really conserved, meaning almost all mammals have all the same bones. There's very little loss and gain of different bones amongst mammals. Almost all of them have everything, but obviously mammals have an incredible amount of shape and morphological diversity. And so the mammal skeleton has been really exaggerated upon in a lot of really fun ways. It's amazing that this right here, phalanx 1 on digit 5 of this bat wing, if you go back in Earth history, that is it too. That one and that one and that one and your pinky bone are all this one, are all the same bone. Whoa, pretty cool. All right, so that's the forelimb. Those are your words for the forelimb: the humerus, the radius, the ulna, carpals in the wrist, metacarpals in the hand, and then phalanges is the catch-all word for the fingers. All right, now let's go to the pelvic girdle. So a lot of you said pelvis, or you could say, I know I have a pelvis, or hips. And so these are the bones that are actually in your pelvic girdle. So sacrum and coccyx are labeled here. They are not part of your pelvic girdle. They are fused. No, you're good. They are fused to your pelvic girdle, of course. But your actual pelvis has a right side and a left side. There's the big swoopy bone on top. That is called the ilium, I-L-I-U-M, the ilium. The bone in the front is the pubis, and the bone in the back is the ischium. All of the, well, you're going to see actually, definitely all the animals, all the vertebrates on land have those three bones, the ilium, the pubis, and the ischium. And those do fuse together to make your pelvis. Usually when people say hips, what they mean is ilium, because the ilium has a big blade, your hip right here. That's the blade of your ilium. All that surface area allows big muscles to attach. So usually powerful muscles insert on the ilium. Here's a very fast dinosaur skeleton. And so that dinosaur from the side view, so the human is in anterior, the dinosaur is in lateral. They still have an ilium, an ischium, and a pubis, and they're absolutely homologous. All tetrapods have these bones. And so then you have your femur. The pelvis is much less complicated than the shoulder. Your femur, so your leg bone, articulates with your pelvis, and the socket it goes into is called the acetabulum. You haven't heard the word acetabulum. That is where the femur articulates with the hips. In most tetrapods, all three bones are in the acetabulum. It's like a little pizza cut into three: pubis, ischium, and ilium, like this. It changes. Some animals are different than that. Dinosaurs just have an open acetabulum. You can see right through it. There's no bone at the back. But anyway, there's your pelvic girdle bones and your femur. All right, then here's the hind limb. Words for the hind limb for you guys to know: femur, tibia, and fibula. Some animals, and I'm going to look it up because I straight up don't remember, have a patella. A patella is like a condensation of bone from cartilage that's not always present. So I have to remember. So tibia and fibula. Tibia is usually the bigger, stronger bone. Fibula is kind of on the side. Fibula is more breakable. You guys watch soccer or football? That's what people are breaking all the time, is their fibula. And then you have your ankle bones, also called the tarsals. There's a bunch of them. There's not just two, there's a lot. And then you have your metatarsals and then your phalanges that make up your toes. I'm glad you asked about the hawk on a horse, because I think this is really great. Talk about this with your neighbors, please. These are the foot bones of a person and the foot bones of a horse. Make some comparisons, please.
Yeah. Because they used to be.
Yeah. That's the whole length. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where are? Yeah, like we're it's like walking on the.
I would have thought of it. That's why we're struggling.
I brought you over. To describe what we did from it, and then-
If you. Okay.
So, that's why you're not.
Those are different. The cool thing is like, it's totally.
All right, what are people talking about with your foot, Noah? Horsing foot.
Let's just walk on one toe and I like.
Which toe do they walk on? What about which finger do they walk on? The same. Horses are always like this, 100% of their lives.
You can tell.
You can tell too. That's right. So that's really cool. That's a real thing. We're going to talk about digits in a second, digit identity, because that's really important across vertebrate anatomy is like which digit's which. But it is true. Horses are walking like this. When birds are flying, they're flying like this. They don't have these ones. When you guys do a T-Rex impression, you ever have like, if you ever did it, or if you have a nephew or a child of your own, and they do a T-Rex, they go like this, because T-Rex has 2 fingers. That's wrong. It's this. It's 1 and 2. But it's still 2. It's just these 2. Anyway, we know those things. That's really cool. All right, so what other things are we noticing besides horses walk on their middle finger and middle toe? Yeah,
Sesamoid bone.
yeah.
But I was just gonna ask, so horses lost the other bones in their feet then? Is that the evolutionary process?
So that is the evolutionary process. So there are, on most horses, you're going to be able to see these extremely narrow, small, thin bones that taper to nothing. So this is metatarsal 3 right here. That's metatarsal 2, and the other side is metatarsal 4. So you can see that. In any living horse, there's like 2 extra metatarsals that don't attach to a toe, and they kind of just fade to nothing. And that was something that people, of course, noticed because we've been riding horses for thousands and thousands of years. And then, yes, in the horse fossil record, the earliest horses, 5 toes. And then for a little while, it's 3, and then they get down to 1. You guys are all from Idaho. Tell me anything about a horse from Idaho. The Hagerman horse is famous and is the state fossil of Idaho because the Hagerman horse, the oldest horse in the genus that all modern horses are in, called Equus, that's down on 1 toe. The Hagerman horse is so famous because it's one of the earliest horses that's doing the bird all the time. Other horses from like Nebraska, they're the same age as Hagerman, still have 3 on the ground. It's really cool. That's why Hagerman's such a big deal. So you had horse evolution, you lose digits. One thing that you guys are going to see throughout this class is there's tons of stuff that evolves throughout animal evolution and then losses. And those losses can be just as interesting. That whale doesn't have a leg I can show you, but it's a mammal, so it definitely did at one point, right? So when we're looking at feet, there's loss. So you said the sesamoid, but then you didn't ask the question, so we're going to move on. We'll talk about sesamoids later. Actually, yeah, we will talk about sesamoids. There might be a whole lab that has a sesamoid. About pandas. You're going to love it. Okay, what other things?
It's weird that humans walk on their heels when
Ooh.
basically nothing else does.
Ooh, that's not true. There are things that walk on their heels. So when you walk with when your heel bone hits the ground first, that's called walking. I don't have those slides, but there's a word for that. It's your stance. It's plantigrade, where our whole foot, every bone of the foot touches the ground. It really is stable, but obviously really uses a lot of your bones. There's like, how many bones are in your foot? So many, and it's just like a horse is walking just on the tip of this. That's if you have a good foot. That's true. That's true. Yeah, look at that. So that's called plantigrade. And there are other animals that are plantigrade. And you guys know that whether you realize it or not, because there's something about them that you identify with. A good example is like a bear is plantigrade. So when a bear walks, you can see its foot. There's like something like skunks are plantigrade. But there's a whole range. A lot of mammals are not. So the horse is called digitigrade. It walks on its digits. Actually, no, like a dog or cat is digitigrade. The horse is just on 1 single toe. That has its own name too. But why would I keep giving you these words that I'm not? We'll talk about them later. It's called unguligrade. Armadillos are too. Armadillos run on their fingernails. Like they don't, like their bones don't touch the ground at all. They just run on their. Anyway, that's armadillos. Armadillos are also an example of mammals that have their own skeleton because all that armor they just made up, like out of their skin. Anyway, not now, not now. So there's some nice words for your hind limb, and there's some points to make again about mammals, but this is going to be true for a lot of vertebrates where homologous elements can be shaped to be completely different and function so differently. So if you guys have a dog or you have a cat or you see a horse or you see a deer or whatever, look at the foot when you see it, because it's everything your foot has. And there's the Achilles tendon, there's that horse hock. It's the same thing. They're just like this. I know you can't see me. They're just like this all the time. Very different than us. All right, this is a homology statement that has the same bones labeled as you've seen before, but there's a bird now and a turtle. And so the thing that I care for you guys to take from this slide, besides this being a really beautiful slide, I turned it sideways so we could see it better. But you know, when you look at it on Moodle, you can turn it right side up if you want to. What's important about this is that this is how anatomists, evolutionary biologists, paleontologists, how we number the digits. So we know which digit we're talking about. And so you guys now know these words so we can use them. Digit numbering goes from medial, so towards the middle of your body, to lateral, the sides of your body. So your big toe or your thumb is digit 1. And then digit 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you have more than that or less than that, things get interesting. More than that, we'll talk about later. Less than that, what becomes important to evolution is like which ones have been lost. So this bird, it's a chicken wing, but I have a sage grouse because Idaho, why not? The same wing, almost. That's digit 2, digit 3, and digit 4. The horse is only on digit 3. Turtle's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Person's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're not worried about it. Dolphin's got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5's way over here. So that's the dolphin's pinky. That's the dolphin's thumb. That's the dolphin's middle finger. That's the dolphin's pointer finger. That's the dolphin's ring finger. So the turtle and you and the bat are the most like, okay, I get it. That's not that crazy. But then the bird and the horse and the dolphin have weird stuff going on. Again, the bones are all color-coded. The keys over here. These are all forelimbs. What I want you guys to take from this slide is this numbering system. So it becomes really important when we see things like losses or when we see gains, if there's more than 5 digits, where that gain is happening, what's going on. We have to know this digit identity. There's lots of ways we can do that. We'll talk about it when it becomes relevant, but I wanted you guys to learn it. The very last thing, and this is like completely out of the blue, and like you're like, what? Is the taxonomy for fins. Everything so far has been pretty heavily focused on the skeleton. So this bass has a skull and a mandible and precaudal vertebrae and caudal vertebrae and ribs. So it has a bunch of the stuff we've talked about, but then I've been leaning pretty hard on land living stuff. I want to give you some terminology for the fins because you guys have a couple fish you're going to look at today. And then this whole week and all of next week is fish bonanza. So you're going to see these words. I have to give them to you at some point. So the fins of fishes all have very specific names because their evolutionary change happens. We can trace it through their fins. So on any fish you want, this one's not hard. This is the ancestral vertebrate condition. You guys actually know it's the chordate condition. Even animals that aren't vertebrates have that post-anal tail or a caudal fin. So on that shark, on that bass, on that coelacanth, that is the caudal fin. There's also pectoral fins. So I'm doing this because I don't have pectoral fins, but I do have pectoral musculature and pectoral bones. So these are fins like this. All fishes, all these jawed fishes have pectoral fins. There are dorsal fins. So on the back of the fish, there could be 2, there could be many more than 2, there could be just 1, there could be none. But there's our dorsal fins, our midline fins on the back. They're in the middle of the animal, on the back. There are pelvic fins for most of these fishes in the world. Actually, yeah, that's fair to say. Almost all fishes in the world have pelvic fins. And so those are paired. You can see they can be in different places. They're kind of way back here on the shark. On the bass, they're way up here. So these are pectoral fins. These are pelvic fins. Pretty close to each other. Just so you guys have this taxonomy a little bit. And then the anal fins are also kind of like dorsal fins, but on the bottom. They're in the middle of the body of the fish, and they're usually associated with the anus. They're behind where the anus is, the anal fins. So those are your fishy fins: caudals, pectorals, dorsals, pelvic, and anal fins. I didn't give them to you in any order. I could have, and I chose not to because we'll get there.
Does the second dorsal fin have a specific name?
Yes, it does. And different fishes, that's really important. And we will talk about that a little bit. Not a ton, but a little bit. So something you guys might know, if any of you are anglers, when you catch a fish, and this is probably the fish you catch. I hope none of you have caught a coelacanth. But if you catch a bass or a walleye or whatever, even a trout, actually not a trout, but if you catch a bass or a walleye, the first dorsal fin is spiky. It will hurt you. And then the second one is soft. So there's variety in the fins. And that actually is a big deal. Okay, that is all I had to like puke out at you of like words and terms. And I hope things that you brought to class, things that you wrote on the dog and the person are a little bit clearer to you now. Like maybe you wrote pelvis, but now you're like, oh, right, I knew ilium, I knew pubis, whatever. Just a little bit of like centered content. Now, I would like to just let you loose for the rest of the lab time to do these lab exercises. So these lab exercises today are all about your observations. You're trying to depict things. You're going to see some things that are pretty open-ended. That's on purpose. You'll turn these into me when you're done. So to give you guys some layouts here, I gave you a bunch of big vertebrate groups. So as you go through, the fishes are back there, I think, right? Yes, I do. Fishes behind you. Yep. Fishes, the frogs and salamanders are back here. Here's the alligator. Here's the birds. Turtles are at the back of this table. Snake and lizard are up front. Mammals are in the back. I'll be walking around. You can definitely talk to each other and work together, move around together. But please be up out of your seats, moving around. Get ready to draw.
Okay. The birds go down. Pick one.